Hello, everyone, Bible believers around the world, and welcome back for episode 10 in this Bible study series. Now, in today's episode, I'm going to be covering these three main things, and these are some things that the One West camps used when teaching the Esau's the white man doctrine. Now, the things that we're going to be covering is, does Esau's blessing from Isaac mean that the Edomites will have earth-conquering empires? And does the fatness of the earth mean Esau was blessed to have the entire earth? So basically, we're going to be covering Esau's blessing, and we're going to be talking about the fatness of the earth and that you shall live by the sword part as well. And we're also going to be covering number two, which number two is very interesting. And number two is racism from whites during the Jim Crow era proof that the Europeans are Esau, because it said that Esau held hatred for Jacob. That's going to be a very interesting one to delve into, because I feel like a lot of people are going to learn some new things. I certainly did. Now, we're also going to be covering number three, which is something that is not commonly taught from the One West camps as much as it used to, as I am aware of. But it is something that I'm still going to cover because I plan to leave no stone unturned in this series. And that is number three, which is, did Esau eat bloody raw meat? Because I remember back in the day, the One West camps would take the lentil soup from Genesis and say that it was raw beef. And then they'll link that up with white people eating medium rare meat, and they'll say that's because Esau liked bloody meat, and that's why that's a thing. But we're going to learn some interesting stuff about that as well. And let's get started. So the first thing in this episode that I'm going to be covering is the hatred and violence that blacks received in America during the Jim Crow era. Now, many One West Camp Israelites like to use the Jim Crow era as proof that the European is Esau, because the scripture says that Esau held a perpetual hatred for Jacob. And then they point to this era in time and the hatred that many whites had for blacks, and they say that this is a result of Esau's perpetual hatred for Jacob. But one question you need to ask yourself is, was the hatred that many whites had for blacks during the Jim Crow era because of the fact that we're Jacob, or was it the fact that it was a prejudice against anyone who was a melanated skinned person, and it was an issue with people looking different? And it's actually very easy to disprove this point that these One West camps make, because one thing that you might not have heard before is that the segregation and mistreatment and hatred that blacks received in America was not just limited to Israelites living in the United States, because the same thing was going on in South Africa during the same time period, where Hamites were actually hated, mistreated, discriminated against, and they actually put up segregation laws against Hamites in South Africa. And another thing that happened during this time period is many people in the U.S. military had bitterness towards Asians, no matter they be Chinese, Korean, or Japanese. So with that in mind, it doesn't hold water, the idea that the hatred that many whites had for blacks during the Jim Crow era was the perpetual hatred of Esau, because everything that we were going through in the United States, Ham was being put through as well. So if it was about hating Jacob, why did these same prejudiced white people segregate the Hamites and we're not Ham? And another thing that I'd like to point out is when you read a lot of these old books from these old white historians, and them talking about their hatred for people of color, they believed that we were Ham. So they linked their hatred to colored folks in America as hatred towards Ham. And then you can precept that up with the history of the South Africans being hated and the segregation against Hamites in South Africa, and you quickly come to realize that this has nothing to do with nationality and that it was a color issue. And we know for a fact that Esau was not a racist, because Esau himself was black, Esau himself was a Hebrew, and Esau himself was a Negro. And Esau married into lineages of other folks of color, and all of his allies were black. You had the Moabites, you had the Philistines, you had the Canaanites, and you had the Egyptians. So when you learn that the things that Israelites went through during the Jim Crow era was also happening to other nationalities of people who are not Israelites, it really starts to make more sense that this is not proof of the European being Esau, because Esau never hated Ham, Esau was never hating the Chinese, Esau was never hating Koreans. And the fact that these white people during this time believed that we were Ham, and that their hatred was a symbol of their hatred towards the Hamite nations, proves it even more, because the segregation in South Africa should not have happened, if this was an Esau versus Jacob thing, because they are not Jacob. So the fact that it was against anybody who looked different makes it very clear about what this was about. It was not about nationality. It was about color prejudice. Now, not to diminish what was going on during the Jim Crow era, but for those One West Camp Israelites who used the teaching that racism from whites is a sign of them being Esau, we're going to find out that there was Israelites who got scattered to different places on the earth who went through even worse things than the black people in the Jim Crow era could even imagine. We had black people who were scattered into China and have been oppressed by Chinese governments. And then the scripture talks about a remnant being left in Cush. And we have Israelites being oppressed by Hamitic, dark-skinned governments. And we're also going to learn about the atrocities that Israelites went through during the Trans-Saharan slave trade from Arabs, which makes Jim Crow, if I'm being honest, look like cupcakes in comparison to what Israelites had to suffer through during the Arab era. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about something that is never brought up by the One West camps, and it's hardly ever brought up in history, and that is the Trans-Saharan slave trade. Because the One West camps like to talk about the Israelites who were scattered into the Americas and the bad treatment that we received, and they use that to prove their doctrine that Esau's the white man because of the anger and dislike that many whites had for blacks during that time period. But what they don't speak of is that not every Israelite was scattered into the Americas or into Europe. There were other Israelites who went into Arabia, and we're going to be learning about some of the things that the Arabs did to Israelites that will shock you and will really make you stop to think if racism is a sign of somebody being Esau. And one thing I want you to look at with this old sketch during this time period is the fact that look what the person looks like who's currently whipping the slaves. We have colored folks on the ground suffering, and the man holding the whip has an afro, and he's dark-skinned as well. So we have black on black hate. So if hatred and dislike, and I think I might have forgot to mention this, but the scriptures tell us in Deuteronomy 28 that Israel would be disliked by all nations. So if you're using, an old white lady at the ice cream shop who didn't, give you a smile, and you're saying that's her Edomite hatred, then what do you have to say about this dark-skinned Arab man with the huge afro whipping up on these slaves?
Civil War. In fact, slavery in the United States was a good bit more humane than slavery in the Arab world. It was bloody for Africans, bloody beyond words. In some cases, African societies would engage in castration as a preemptive measure to protect their youth from being captured and castrated by Arab slave traders. This reflects the deep fear and trauma associated with this practice.
So here is a news article that I found online a few days ago from Middle East News, and it's talking about the treatment of Africans in Arabia, and here's what the title of the article is: The Saudis Treated Us Like Animals. Alright? So when you get to understand that this is a nationality thing and not a color thing, it really makes you stop to question the One West Camp doctrine about a white person being racist means that they're Esau, when we've already found out that holds no water and makes absolutely no sense, because a racist white person doesn't like the Chinese, they don't like the Koreans, they don't like the Japanese, they don't like any of the Hamite nations, and they don't like the Israelites. So how is it an Israelite problem when all they care about is the melanin part? Because if there was an Israelite who was light-skinned, they probably would have nothing to say. And that's been proven before. You have a light-skinned person and they receive less issues. So it's a prejudice against someone looking different. It has nothing to do with nationality. And so many things that these One West camps don't teach is the fact that the white man only showed up on the scene in the book of Maccabees. Before Maccabees, all of our oppressors and everybody who mistreated us, yes, Esau included, were all black. So white versus, black crime is something way newer than so-called black on black crime. All right? And one thing that we can also look into is when bitterness for blacks started, that's something that's actually kind of new. Because originally, like I was saying, when people were following the biblical template of the world, people were prejudiced against nation. Just like I'll cover some other time, but Miriam got mad at Moses for his wife because she was a Hamite. She didn't start ranting to him about how her skin's too dark or she's too light. She attacked her nationality. That's what she was prejudiced for. And that's what people did back in the day. But when you start to look into white supremacism and issues along that lines, that stuff started happening in the 1700s and 1800s when you had these old bitter dudes writing these books saying that that they're better than the descendants of Ham, and that Ham is like dogs because they believe we were Ham, which goes back to what I mentioned about Jim Crow. They thought they were oppressing Ham. They did not believe that they hated Israel. That was not even in their mind. They thought they were hating Ham. And when you realize it, that the racism went up after those supremacist books. So if they were Esau, they would have hated us the whole time. But that hatred didn't pop off until they started reading these bad books telling them that they're superior and that they should not be friendly towards other people. Because you go, before that, this is, will piss a lot of One West campers off, but the Sephardic Jews, Israelites scattered into Spain, had lots of good relationships with the white Jabbatites who were there and intermarried with the white people of Portugal and Spain. So why was Esau friendly then? Why was Israel and Esau, loving each other then? But all of a sudden now this Esau hatred thing is, what's going on? Because it's a color prejudice. It's a dislike for someone being different. That's what racism is. Racism doesn't care about nationality. That's why a racist dude will have an issue with somebody who's Ham, somebody who's Israel, and someone who's Chinese, because they don't like the color of your skin. It has nothing to do with where you're from. And it goes both ways. We have prejudice, racist people of color who they don't like what the British did to them, but they'll bully a Russian because their skin color is the same way, even though they're not of the same nationality. See, racism is just dumb, but that's what I wanted to get across. Jim Crow has nothing to do with Esau. And, learning about the oppression of the Hamites, learning, and blacks have received hatred from people who weren't white. So how do you explain that?